President Ronald Reagan has died this afternoon in Los Angeles in his home in the Bel Air suburb of Los Angeles. Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States. He was 93 years old, the longest living president in U.S. history. We did see very little of former President Reagan in these last few years because he has been suffering for more than 10 years with Alzheimer's. We were told that he was suffering from pneumonia in the last few days and had taken a turn for the worse in the last week. Once again, last night his family was notified. His children were summoned to his bedside, reportedly the family knowing that, in fact, his death was imminent. Former Ronald Reagan once again reportedly dead in Los Angeles. We're going to go now to ABC's Brian Rooney, who's standing by live outside the house in Bel Air. Brian, have you seen any activity there as of yet?
Well, we're starting to get some activity now, Elizabeth. Michael Reagan, the president's oldest son, just arrived. His car just went through the gates moments before you came to me. The telltale in all of this came at about 6 o'clock this morning when President Reagan's youngest children arrived at 6 o'clock this morning. Ron Reagan Jr. and Patty Davis came here. They didn't speak to the press. No one from the family has spoken to the press today, but through a variety of sources from the White House and friends and family, we had been led to believe throughout the day that President Reagan's death was imminent. We didn't know exactly when. They said it could have gone on for several more days. But we were told he had pneumonia. That is very serious for a man who's 93 years old and bedridden. And the end was expected. Elizabeth?
All right, Brian Rooney, we'll come back to you in just a few moments as obviously events are unraveling right now. This event, the death of President Reagan, has unleashed a well-planned series of events. President Reagan's body will be taken to a funeral home in Santa Monica and then after that taken to the Reagan Presidential Library in the Simi Valley area in the Los Angeles area. We're going to go right now to Sam Donaldson, who was the ABC News correspondent covering the White House during both of President Reagan's terms in office. First, Sam, your reaction to the news just now.
Well, Ronald Reagan was in the White House, Elizabeth, during an exciting and important period in our country's history. And I think it's fair to say that he, by force of his personality and, of course, some of his policies, changed that history for the better. You remember when he came to the presidency, we were still reeling as a country from Vietnam, from Watergate. We'd had gas lines. We had our diplomats seized in Iran. But I think the hallmark of this president was his internal optimism, which he expressed, and the fact that we were a good company. Remember, he always talked about a shining city on the hill, and he made us feel that things were going to be okay again. He was the optimist, and the old joke, Elizabeth, was that if Ronald Reagan was asked to shovel out manure from a stable, he would fall to with a will, knowing that he'd find a pony under all that stuff. So we'll be talking for hours and days and maybe years about his legacy. But to me, the first thing that came to my mind was we had an optimist in the White House that told us we were a good people, and we believed him.
Indeed, Sam, an optimist who is known to so many and to the entire world as the great communicator. Will be listening to many examples of how wonderfully eloquent former President Reagan was. But first, stand by for a second. I'd like to go to Lou Cannon, who was the Reagan biographer. Lou was also a journalist who covered President Reagan since 1964. He was a White House reporter for the Washington Post during the Reagan years, as well as the author of several Reagan books. Lou Cannon, very quickly, with the news today of President Reagan's death, what will he most be remembered for in your estimation?
I think he's going to be remembered for three things, Elizabeth. The first of all is restoring confidence in the people in their country when it was at a very low ebb. The second is for the role he played in ending the Cold War. And the third is that Ronald Reagan really brought conservatives into the mainstream. Conservative Republicans were an endangered species in the mid-1960s when Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California. And the conservative resurgence we've seen over the last 3 or 4 decades is really the product of Ronald Reagan's efforts, starting in California and continuing in Washington.
He really did rally the conservative wing of the party to great effect. And was one of the most popular presidents when he exited the White House after 8 years, and even after several scandals in office, went out with great, hugely high popularity numbers.
He had the most, according to the Gallup numbers, he was the most popular president when he left office since FDR died in office in 1945.
What would you say, Lou, in your estimation, and given also your long-term covering him as well, we'll be talking with Sam about this as well, the high points of his office, the things you remember most about him also as a man?
What I remember most about him as president was that magnificent speech he gave in Berlin, where he calls upon Mr. Gorbachev. He says, tear down that wall. What I remember most about him as a person, writing 5 books about him and knowing him since 1965, was that he was a consistently decent and courteous person. You could write negative stories about him, which I did. You could do negative reports about him like Sam did. And Ronald Reagan still treated you with courtesy and respect. It's a rare quality in politics. In fact, it's a rare quality in life.
Indeed, you are very correct there. Lou, stand by if you will for just a second. I want to go to ABC's Terry Moran, who's traveling with President Bush in Paris right now. Terry, I know the White House had gotten some word that, in fact, President Reagan's condition had taken a turn for the worse. Have you heard any reaction officially from the White House yet to his death today?
No reaction as of yet, Elizabeth. What we have heard, talking about this earlier with senior White House officials, first, they said obviously President Bush has tremendous admiration for President Reagan. Much of this President Bush's political career has been inspired by the conservatism that Ronald Reagan led for so many decades. And second, right now President Bush is in the midst of a very intense world schedule, but we were told that he has every intention of attending the funeral of President Reagan.
In fact, because President Bush is the current President Bush is the son of President Reagan's vice president, I would imagine there's a personal relationship there as well. There were some strains that were bandied about in the press between the Reagans and the Bushes, in particular President Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, President Bush 41. But there's no question that not only President Bush, but that the leading figures of his administration, Vice President Cheney, Secretary of State Powell, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, all draw tremendous inspiration in their sense of America's role in the world, the use of America's might to advance American ideals, from the words that Ronald Reagan had been saying to the American people dating back to the 1950s, and they are open in their admiration. This is certainly a sad day for the president and for many of the members of this administration who worked for Ronald Reagan. And in fact, Terry, you are right now in France as President Bush goes there to commemorate the 60th anniversary of D-Day. And one of the many most eloquent clips we've seen of President Reagan in his history as a president and a great communicator was when he was marking an anniversary of D-Day there as well 10 years ago.
What a powerful speech that was, Elizabeth. Just etched in everyone's memory who heard it, where he said with the then 60-some-year-old veterans of the assault on Pointe du Hoc, that knife-like rock above Omaha Beach, where he said, these are the boys of Pointe du Hoc, these are the men who took the cliffs, and many of them were in tears as President Reagan struggled to contain his own emotions. It's funny, I was talking to one of the White House officials who's responsible for what President Bush will say tomorrow, commemorating the 60th anniversary of that assault, and they said, you know, it's impossible to rise to that level. It's just so hard to make one of these speeches after Ronald Reagan.
It really is. In fact, Terry, as we talk about the speech, we have some videotape of that. Let's take a look right now at President Ronald Reagan when he gave the speech commemorating an anniversary of D-Day in France.
225 came here. After 2 days of fighting, only 90 could still bear arms. Behind me is a memorial that symbolizes the Ranger daggers that were thrust into the top of these cliffs. And before me are the men who put them there. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war.
There you see President Ronald Reagan on the 40th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy speaking to a group of vets there. 20 years later, of course, President Bush is there to commemorate another anniversary. We'll be checking back in with Terry Moran, who I'm sure will have more from the White House as it reacts to the death of Ronald Reagan this afternoon in Los Angeles. The last image we have of President Reagan was taken on his 89th birthday. He was there with his wife, Nancy, who was, as always, by his side. Just a few years before that, or after that, was in 1997. There was a chance encounter in a park between a young boy and the ailing president. This is in Los Angeles. Somebody there obviously taking a picture But as Alzheimer's disease took hold, President Reagan retreated more and more into his house in the Los Angeles suburb of Bel Air. The great communicator, as he was called, closed off from the world by a disease that ravaged his mind. He saw very, very few visitors in the last few years. His visits to his own office became rare, although he did attend a celebration there for his 86th birthday. Reagan's last formal public appearances were in 1994. He returned to Washington for a Republican Party fundraiser a few days before his 83rd birthday. That same year, he also attended the funeral of former President Richard Nixon. Only months later, he revealed he had Alzheimer's in an open letter to the American people. Ronald Reagan left the White House more than a decade ago, but his legacy remains as powerful as ever.